They thought she was just another quiet ICU nurse, the kind who kept her head down, spoke only when spoken to, and blended into the hum of monitors and fluorescent lights. But the truth was far more dangerous, far more classified, and far more extraordinary than anyone in St. Aurora Medical Center could imagine. Because on the night the Navy SEALs landed in the hospital parking lot and demanded to see Lieutenant Reyes, the entire hospital would realize that the woman they had underestimated wasn't just a nurse at all. She was a weapon they never saw coming. Long before that night, Reyes had learned how to disappear in plain sight. And at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday that felt no different from 100 other graveyard shifts, she stood at the central ICU station with her blonde hair tied into a tight bun, pale blue eyes fixed on a row of glowing monitors, fingers moving silently across a chart while the rest of the unit pulsed with the familiar rhythm of controlled chaos. Ventilators sighing, infusion pumps ticking, distant footsteps echoing through sterile corridors. While behind the desk 2 residents whispered about her the way people always did when they assumed she couldn't hear, calling her slow, timid, overly cautious, the kind of nurse who triple-checked everything because she lacked confidence, the kind who never argued, never challenged orders, never raised her voice. And Reyes listened without reacting because she had learned long ago that invisibility was safer than confrontation, safer than recognition, safer than questions. To the attending physicians, she was competent but unremarkable, a nurse who followed protocol perfectly but never pushed boundaries. And to the younger staff, she was almost forgettable, except for the strange way she noticed things others missed, the faint irregularities in heart rhythms before alarms sounded, the subtle changes in oxygen saturation before patients deteriorated, the micro delays in speech patterns that hinted at neurological decline. And when she spoke, it was always measured, precise, devoid of emotion, as if she were reading data rather than caring for human beings. Earlier that evening, during rounds, Dr. Carter had snapped at her for suggesting a medication adjustment, reminding her sharply that nurses didn't diagnose, and Reyes had simply nodded and stepped back, her face unreadable, because she understood hierarchy better than anyone in the building, and she knew that sometimes the fastest way to survive was to let others believe they were in control. No one knew that beneath the plain scrubs and hospital badge was a past she had buried so deeply it barely felt real anymore. A past filled with sandstorms, gunfire, and screaming over encrypted radios. But occasionally, when the ICU lights flickered or a sudden loud noise cracked through the ward, something in her eyes shifted, something older than fear, something closer to instinct, and she would pause for a fraction of a second before returning to her work with the same quiet precision. That night, an ambulance screeched into the bay and paramedics rushed in with a trauma patient pulled from a highway accident, a man in his late 30s with multiple fractures and unstable vitals. And the ICU team moved fast, but not fast enough, voices overlapping, orders colliding, uncertainty creeping into the room like fog, while Reyes stood at the edge of the chaos watching every detail with surgical clarity. The way the man's chest rose unevenly, the faint tremor in his hands, the subtle shift in his pupils. And when Dr. Carter ordered the patient transferred without further intervention, Reyes hesitated for the first time anyone noticed, her gaze fixed on the monitor as if it were speaking a language only she understood. And when she finally spoke, her voice cut through the noise with unexpected authority. "He's not stable," she said quietly, and the room froze for half a heartbeat before the doctor snapped back that she was overreacting, that she should follow orders, that this wasn't her call. And Reyes stepped back again, her expression returning to neutral. But seconds later the monitor screamed, and the patient crashed, sending the team into panic while Reyes moved instantly, not with the frantic energy of the others, but with calm, lethal efficiency, her hands steady as she initiated a procedure that no one expected a nurse to perform, her movements precise, almost rehearsed, as if she had done this not in a hospital, but somewhere far less forgiving. And when the patient stabilized, the ICU fell silent, every eye in the room slowly turning toward her, not with gratitude but with suspicion, because competence was acceptable, but mastery was unsettling. And for the first time since Reyes had joined St. Aurora, people began to wonder who she really was. Later, in the break room, whispers spread like wildfire. Where did she learn that? How did she know? Why didn't she panic? And Reyes sat alone with a paper cup of coffee, staring at the steam as if it were smoke rising from another life, her hands resting on the table, not shaking, never shaking, while somewhere deep inside her memory replayed scenes she tried not to remember. Helicopters cutting through desert skies, medics shouting coordinates, wounded men gripping her wrists and begging her not to let them die. She pushed the memories away and stood up, returning to the ICU just as the night shift settled into its usual rhythm. But something had changed, something invisible yet irreversible, because when she walked past the nurse's station, conversation stopped, and when she adjusted a ventilator or checked a drip line, people watched her with new eyes, as if they sensed that the quiet nurse was not as ordinary as she seemed. And outside the hospital walls, unseen by anyone inside, a black unmarked helicopter crossed the skyline of the city, its rotors slicing through the darkness as it moved toward St. Aurora Medical Center with deliberate purpose, carrying men who didn't wear hospital badges or white coats, men who didn't ask questions twice, men who knew exactly who they were looking for. And as Reyes stood beneath the cold fluorescent lights of the ICU, unaware that the distance between her hidden past and her carefully constructed present was about to collapse, one thing was already certain. The hospital thought they understood her, but by morning they would learn the truth, that Reyes was never just an ICU nurse, and that some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried forever. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the noise. It was the feeling, the sudden shift in the air that Reyes had learned to recognize long before she ever wore hospital scrubs. A subtle pressure that made her lift her eyes from the chart in her hands as the ICU continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that its fragile calm was about to collapse. It was nearing 4 a.m., the hour when exhaustion, dulled judgment, and mistakes were most likely to happen, when nurses moved on instinct and doctors relied on habit. And Reyes stood at the nurse's station listening to the distant hum of the building when the glass panels along the corridor began to tremble almost imperceptibly. A vibration too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to ignore, and while others dismissed it as construction noise or passing traffic, Reyes didn't, because she knew that sound, she knew what followed it, and before she could fully process the memory rising in her chest, the security alarms at the front entrance erupted, sharp and insistent, slicing through the quiet of the ward. Moments later, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, not rushed, not chaotic, but synchronized, controlled, and when the doors burst open, a line of men in dark tactical gear entered the ICU with disciplined precision, their movements efficient, their eyes alert, their presence instantly transforming the sterile hospital corridor into something that felt dangerously unfamiliar. Nurses froze mid-step, residents stared in disbelief, and Dr. Carter stepped forward, demanding to know what was happening. But the lead operator didn't slow down, didn't answer, didn't even look at him, his gaze moving across the room until it found Reyes, and when he stopped, the world seemed to narrow to a single point as he spoke in a calm, unmistakable voice. "Lieutenant Reyes." The words landed like a shockwave, leaving behind stunned silence, and every eye in the ICU turned toward Reyes, who stood motionless, her expression unreadable, while Dr. Carter laughed nervously and insisted there must be a mistake, reminding everyone that Reyes was just a nurse. But the operator didn't waver, his attention fixed on her with absolute certainty. For a moment Reyes said nothing, as if weighing the cost of truth against the comfort of anonymity, and when she finally moved, it was with quiet acceptance rather than surprise, her posture subtly changing as she walked toward the operator, the invisible line between her past and present dissolving with every step, and the staff watched in disbelief as the quiet nurse they thought they knew seemed to transform before their eyes, her presence sharper, her silence heavier, her authority suddenly undeniable. The operator explained that a critically injured SEAL was bleeding out in the helicopter outside, his injuries too complex for civilian protocols, and that they needed her immediately. And while Dr. Carter tried to reassert control, citing hospital rules and procedures, Reyes listened calmly, her eyes focused, her mind already calculating possibilities. And when the operator asked if she was coming, she didn't hesitate. She simply nodded once, a small gesture that carried the weight of a decision she had been avoiding for years. The SEAL team moved instantly, clearing a path as Reyes followed them through the corridor, her footsteps steady, her expression composed, while behind her the ICU remained frozen in silence, slowly realizing that they had never truly known the woman who worked beside them. And outside, the roar of the helicopter engines grew louder as Reyes stepped into the night, leaving behind the life she had tried so hard to keep ordinary, because from that moment on, there was no going back. The night air hit Reyes like a familiar memory as she stepped onto the helipad, the roar of the helicopter engines vibrating through her bones with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. And for a brief moment, she wasn't an ICU nurse standing outside a hospital, but a combat medic standing on foreign soil, surrounded by men whose lives depended on her decisions. The SEAL team moved around her with effortless coordination, their voices sharp and controlled, while inside the helicopter a wounded operator lay strapped to a stretcher, his breathing shallow, his skin pale, the metallic smell of blood cutting through the cold air. And as Reyes climbed aboard, the world seemed to narrow again, not with fear this time, but with focus, because chaos had always been the environment where she understood herself most clearly. The hospital staff watched from behind glass doors, unable to hear the commands being exchanged, but able to see the transformation they had never imagined. The quiet nurse, now giving precise instructions, her voice steady, her movements decisive, her hands working with speed and confidence that bordered on impossible, while Dr. Carter stood among them in silence, realizing too late that he had mistaken restraint for weakness and caution for incompetence. Inside the helicopter, Reyes assessed the injury with a level of clarity that stunned even the SEALs, identifying complications that standard protocols would have missed and improvising solutions that no civilian training could have prepared her for. And when the operator's vitals began to stabilize, a collective breath seemed to leave the aircraft, not in celebration but in respect, because everyone there understood that they had just witnessed something rare. A person who belonged equally to two worlds and yet fully to neither. When Reyes finally stepped back from the stretcher, her gloves stained, her expression unreadable, the lead SEAL looked at her with quiet admiration and said, almost to himself, that the hospital had no idea who they had been working beside all this time. And Reyes glanced once more toward the glowing windows of St. Aurora, where silhouettes of nurses and doctors stood frozen in disbelief. And she felt no pride, no anger, only a distant sense of inevitability, because she had never wanted to be seen, only to save lives in whatever way she could. As the helicopter lifted into the sky, its lights fading into the darkness, the hospital slowly returned to its routines. But something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone, because from that night forward, no one who had witnessed Lieutenant Reyes would ever look at the quiet ICU nurse the same way again. And somewhere between the sterile corridors of civilian medicine and a brutal reality of war, Reyes understood that hiding was no longer an option, not because she had been exposed, but because she had finally been remembered.